So real quick, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers today. So Dr. Hyatt Frobose serves as the USA Commercial Director and Nutritionist for the JYGA Technologies, which is a Quebec-based company that produces Gestalt brand precision feeding systems for the swine industry. Hyatt specializes in assisting swine producers with group housing solutions and nutritional programs to optimize performance and welfare of gestating and lactating sows in commercial environments. In 2005, Dr. Frobose completed his doctorate degree in swine nutrition and management at Kansas State University, where he co-authored or authored 8 referred journal articles and 22 abstracts. This research was focused on nutrition and reproduction interactions in gestating lactating sows and the effects of mycotoxins on pig growth. Hyatt is based out of Greenlee, Kansas, where he, his wife, Brandy, and his daughter, Oakley, own and operate a seed stock Gelbvieh cow calf operation. Brian Strobel is graduated with his master's at Purdue University in ag engineering in 1996. His thesis was on the effects of management practices on air quality in farrowing rooms. And he works for Gestalt as the regional sales and service representative and lives in Knoxville, Tennessee with his wife, Catherine, daughter, Sophia, and son, Austin. Brian was a contract grower, farm operator, owner for 7 years, having farms with Smithfield and Cargill JBS. He serves as the National Swine Improvement Federation Board and the Animal Ag Allies. In the past 4 weeks, Brian has traveled to farms in Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Utah, where he does a lot of pen gestation work, farrowing, and growth fitness research, and precision feeding. So throughout the presentation, just feel free to ask any questions, either by using the chat or by unmuting your mic, and they will try to answer those. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Brian and Hyatt for their presentation.
Thank you, Carissa. I'm going to lead off tonight, and then I'll turn it over to Hyatt to go through some more details and examples. Our main goal is tonight to keep you all engaged for the full hour. So help us to achieve that goal. Like Carissa said, ask questions as we go, either in the chat box or ask questions verbally, and then or we can answer them at the end. So as you see here, the title of our presentation being California Prop 12. And so where do we go from here? And then the next slide, we talk about our outline for tonight. So we'll go into some detail about what Proposition 12 is. What does that mean for us as the U.S. swine industry? So if I'm a producer, how can I be compliant? This next one, pay attention to this. This is, I think, the most important one, the pros and cons of a Prop 12 style production. There's lots of questions about that. So Hyatt's going to present a lot of that to you. And then we get into enforcement and key takeaways. And on these slides too, you'll see some photos to give some background of how sow production currently done and then as it is when we're converting. So for Prop 12, this was a ballot initiative in California on November 6, 2018, and it passed. It's called the Farm Animal Confinement Initiative, and 2 groups there are in charge of implementation. So it's the California Department of Ag, or Food and Agriculture, so CDFA, and the California Department of Public Health, CDPH. As you see here, the act applies to breeding pigs, laying hens, and veal calves. So some background, if you don't know, laying hens need 144 square inches or 1 square foot. Veal calves need, according to the act, 43 square feet. Both those were implemented January 1 of 2020. For breeding pigs, that will take effect January 1 of 2022. As you see bullet point 3, this is a key one. It applies to pork sold in California, regardless of origin, which means most pork sold in California comes from out of state. They don't have a large pork industry, so most of it is brought in after it's been processed or processed in California, but raised elsewhere. And then the last bullet point you see here, there's been several attempts to overturn this based on the Interstate Commerce Clause. this really gets into the states' rights issue on appeal versus the Interstate Commerce Clause. So we highlight Section 2 here, which really says it's addressing the confinement issues. And what we highlight in yellow is, which also, in their words, or animal rights groups' words, threaten the health and safety of California consumers. So neither Hyatt and I are attorneys, but wanted to give you some background on that proposition. Next slide. And then you see important details for us on the swine side, basically 180 days or 6 months or older. So a gilt or any sow, multi-para sow, the rest of her life, this applies to them. It does not apply to farrowing, nor does it apply to finishing. There's 2 key points in my mind to the rule, and Hyatt will expand on these, but one of them is here, the second bullet point, at least 24 square foot of usable space. This gets a lot of the attention. I think most of us know currently in the industry, we have 16 to 20 square foot. That's really our sweet spot, whether it's in stalls or some type of pens currently. So this is a big jump going to 24 square foot, which means we lose inventory in the barn unless we're recouping it from aisles or other ways, but it's got to be usable space. They're not laying on a trough. It's got to be flat floor space that they can use. And then the other key point there on this slide being to turn around freely. So as we're showing in the photo, they're in stalls in this caption. So she can't turn around in that. She'd hit the side of the stall or the crate, or if she was near a wall, she's got to be able to turn around freely. Next. And then the exemptions are important also. I know Hyatt will talk about these. To me, the first one that jumps out at me is the 24 or the 6-hour rule per day, as you see in the second column. So the 6-hour rule plus the 24 square foot are 2 of the main considerations. And notice it says 6 hours in a 24-hour period and not greater than 24 hours in a 30-day period. I know we got to stop and think about that for a minute, but that's not very long. That entails breeding, heat checking, vaccinating, or preg checking. So usually we're breeding in a stall. So this is, a mindset change for a lot of us on animal husbandry. The other exemptions being if we need to treat an individual sow, whether she's going into a stall or whether she's going into a pen, we've got to be careful though that we're not double counting space, because we're already space is at a premium with 24 square foot. Then you can see the other ones we highlighted, the 5 days prior to breeding and then while nursing. So like I said, farrowing doesn't change, finishing doesn't change. And I should also highlight the asterisk at the bottom. This applies to whole meat, whole pork meat, not to combination processed. Next. And then, so what does this mean? So there's 40 million people in California, 331 people in the US, that's 12% of our population. From the USDA figures, about 9,000 sows have already been converted as of last year. That's less than 4% of US farms currently compliant. So roughly that means at least 225,000 sows need to be converted. So if we're at 6 million sows in the US, that's still a lot of sows to go. Most of us, bottom line, have not converted yet. So the last bullet point there, we show the conversion cost being from $1,600 to $2,500 per sow, rough numbers. But I know all of us think there's a lot of deferred maintenance that's getting done at the same time. So conversion cost, we know construction cost is higher due to metal prices, lumber's gone up, other building materials. So we're given some rough estimate there, but there's also other things being done at the same time. The conversion plus deferred maintenance or electrical work or other work needs to be done. I'd also like to state here too, California is not the only state with an act. Massachusetts has a similar state statute known as Question 3, and it passed in 2016. 77% of the state vote. And what's unique about that is Indiana and all others, so there's 13 states in that lawsuit versus Massachusetts. It went to the US Supreme Court in 2017. It was voted on in January 2019 and denied the states the rights to complain or file a complaint against Massachusetts on this statute. So California gets most of the attention. Massachusetts also has a statute. Next. And I'm sure most of us have seen similar articles to this. This is from Rabobank talking about most or possible disruptions in the pork U.S. supply chain for 2022. Based on here we are late March, we've got 9 months to convert. Most of the farms have not yet converted or being in various stages of conversion. So projecting a disruption for next year for California. Currently, there is not a premium for pork going into California. Doing the conversion is a barrier to entry to be able to sell into that market. So that's the current landscape we have. With that, I know Hyatt was going to go ahead and explain animal care methods, opportunities for targeted feeding and gestation, and our firsthand experience that we've had in helping producers as they make this transition. Turn it over to Hyatt.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate you guys having me on tonight, as well as Brian. And I know we maybe cover everything on this topic, but I think even the time we've allocated, we're probably just touching the tip of the iceberg with some of the conversations that Brian and I have been a part of with a lot of the large production systems in the U.S. And I know tonight we have a mixed audience of students, professors, producers, industry experts. And so I kind of want to touch on some quick background things just to give you guys all perspective. And obviously we can dive deeper on questions as needed, but certainly how producers are handling this challenge and how they're reacting to this. But I thought a good place to start is just to show people what square footage looks like at different points. And so I've got some pictures of sows stocked at different stocking densities, and I think that helps people recognize what 24 square feet means. Just to give a little background, Brian and I have been involved in group housing transitions for producers who use our equipment for the past 6 years, and we've helped over 200,000 sows in the U.S. convert and do so strategically. But the Prop 12 implementation is something that's relatively new to us in the past year as well. And so adopting group housing with those particular protocols is something still in the works. But so this is an example of a picture showing 15 square feet per sow. As most of you guys could probably agree, this is pretty tight. To me, this is probably about as cramped as you'd want your sows to be and likely to cause some aggression and some bottlenecking in areas. But just to go up from there, this is an example of a picture of group housing at 19.25 square feet per sow, a little more square feet than the previous picture. And this is a square footage that a lot of people would land on today in commercial retrofits from stalls to pens. Here's another example of a similar square footage at 19.5 square feet. And you can see that when the sows are up and moving around and laying down, they have enough room to spread out, enough room to move around each other, and yet still lay together where they want to in certain bedroom areas and such. If I go beyond this square footage, which I would say is relatively middle of the road or average for the industry today, here's an example of a extra amount of square footage. This is a picture with shoulder stalls at 21.5 square feet. Compared to the previous pictures, you can see there's a lot more unoccupied space there. That shows that this is an amount of square footage that is pretty open, and it's still 2.5 square foot per sow less than California's requirements. To go beyond California, I actually don't have a great picture of the 24 square feet, but just to show what a pen looks like when you have a lot more square feet, this is an example of a farm that's producing for Whole Foods, and they have requirements of 32 square feet per sow. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of a barometer on what these farms look like at these different square footages, and the cost it might take to maintain a facility at those different square footages is definitely something important to keep in mind. But moving on from there, I want to kind of transition to, let's go with the example of if you've got a farm and you want to become compliant for Prop 12 to have access to the California market after the end of this year. This is an example of a 2,800 sow layout. This is actually a farm in Indiana that I just using as an example. But the top barn in this picture is an example of gestation. And in this example, this farm is almost 100% gestation stalls. Up at the top right corner, you can see some pens that they use for cull sows and for incoming gilts. But 95% gestation individual stalls today. Down below that is their typical farrowing barn, which for the most part is not going to be impacted by California Prop 12. And at the bottom, they have a connected gilt development barn where they're going to develop gilts from weaning age up until they come into the farm as a breeding eligible female. And so just recapping there, gestation is the area where the biggest changes are having to occur on these farms, because sows must change from somewhere around 14 to 15 square foot per sow today to 24 square feet at California's requirements. Again, in farrowing, no change is needed. Points to take away from this is, even though we may not have to change farrowing, most of these farms have built farrowing to house a number of sows for an exact length of time to wean those 21 days or plus or minus. And if we have to decrease our number of farrowing space or our number of gestation spaces, all of a sudden we have excess farrowing spaces that we now need to determine how to utilize that space. Finally, there on the gilt development phase, is the gilt development barn something that's absolutely necessary? A lot of producers are looking at those on-site GDUs as a place to maybe capitalize on some extra space to convert that to gestation and raise their gilts off-site. But one of the key points that Brian brought up as part of this requirement is that any gilt older than 6 months still has to be housed at 24 square feet. Most of the time, we're going to be not breeding gilts until 26, 27 weeks of age, again, plus or minus. So we do have gilts often at the latter stages of the GDU that are ones that are being regulated by the California requirements. And so that's something we can't ignore, is that if we're going to be getting enforced on this, those gilts that are over 180 days of age are also going to be forced to have more space. One thing that a lot of people that are new to this look at and say, well, isn't group housing already where the industry is heading or going? And why couldn't most of those farms comply for California? I think it's important for those of you that maybe aren't in sow farms regularly to understand that the farm example that I had in the previous slide today has mostly gestation stalls, 2,724 total spaces in that barn footprint for a 2,800 sow farm where they have spaces in farrowing as well. But most farms that we've worked with at Gestall and that most other production systems have in pen gestation are typically today keeping gestation stalls through pregnancy check. So they'll typically wean sows into a gestation stall. They'll detect estrus and AI the sow in a gestation stall, and then keep her in that stall or another stall in the barn until they have a chance to confirm pregnancy and move her to a pen environment, which is most of the time going to average around 35 to 42 days of gestation. So down below, I have a picture. There's a picture of an example farm with typical pen gestation. What a lot of outsiders or consumers sometimes don't understand is that in typical pen gestation, there's still usually about half of the sows that are housed in gestation stalls because of that breeding through pregnancy check period. Not so fast with Prop 12 in California, though. With Prop 12, we can't have them in stalls at all, other than for a 6-hour period, which Brian outlined. And so if we look again at that 2,724 spaces today, actually, I'll step back a slide here quick. One of the important things about most pen gestation farms today is that depending on the feeding system and strategy you employ, a lot of pen gestation farms that convert from stalls can still maintain a similar amount of sows in that farm because they're typically going to run 18 to 20 square feet per sow. They're not mandated to run 24 square feet. And a good chunk of animal welfare research would say that 19 to 20 square feet is pretty adequate if you do the other things right in group housing, like water location, feed system location, slat location. And so it's frustrating in some ways that the California requirements are requiring 24 square feet, which is not really backed by sound research and science. So the big difference here for a lot of these guys that are converting to Prop 12 is that today they have 2,724 square feet or spaces in their farm. But if they want to convert to a Prop 12 compliant facility, in this kind of best case scenario, they converted to 2,174 spaces. So kind of best case scenario, they're losing about 20% of the animals that they could house in there prior to Prop 12. And that causes a downstream crescendo of, I have less sows to breed, I have less sows to farrow, I have less sows to take to farrowing. And all of those things add to the complications with Prop 12, because this is obviously a costly transition, but it's even harder on producers when they're currently expecting to produce less pigs at the end of the day. So producers are faced with a scenario of either decreasing their sow inventory in breeding and gestation, or build or expand additional footprint to be able to get back to the right number of B&G spaces. And that's where that estimate of $1,600 to $2,500 per sow space comes in Brian's earlier example, and multiply that by 600 sows in this example, that gets pretty costly for most producers. And this is an average farm, but not even one of the larger farms that'll be adopting these type of procedures. So to give everybody in the audience some better context, there's a lot of different feed systems that producers can use for group housing. And we're not here today to talk about one being better than others, but maybe talk a little bit just about pros and cons to different ones. But until about 5 to 10 years ago, these were the main options that producers had used: floor feeding, shoulder stalls, free access stalls, and electronic sow feeders. And then about 8 years ago, free access, which combines the elements of free access stalls and ESF, also came onto the market as a 5th category. And that just so happens to be the category that Brian and I represent in our group housing work. But I'll be the first to admit that any of these options can work if designed and implemented effectively. It really comes down to how they're being done and managed. But just to break that down a little further, they're usually categorized into 2 sections: competitive feeding, which is typically seen as floor feeding or shoulder stanchions. And that's where sows are gaining access to feed by fighting or aggression. So sows are typically fed simultaneously, and they have access to feed at the same time. And generally they're trying to get their feed, but you can't typically feed those animals individually because of the fact that you don't know where those animals are going to be eating from and who's going to be eating the fastest or the slowest. Non-competitive feed systems, by contrast, include electronic sow feeders, free access stalls, and the free access ESF category that I described earlier. In these systems, sows can be fed individually, but they cannot gain feed by fighting with each other, and their only opportunity for competition is going to be around entry to the feeding area, either the ESF station or the free access stall individually. Just to show that there are some pros and cons to these different feeding systems, I've always liked this kind of pretty brief report by PIC on group housing that was released back in 2016. Across the top horizontally, you can see different housing types, and across the vertical side, you can see the different categories and how they're rated. The categories that have pluses indicate the more the better. The categories with X's mean the less the better. So for example, body condition management in individual gestation stalls can be really good, and so it's rated at the highest. Whereas an outdoor housing of sows, it's very hard to control body condition, so it's rated the poorest. Conversely, if we look at feed usage, electronic sow feeders are rated very well for feed usage because they're going to be able to feed sows exactly what they're programmed to receive based on their body condition and stage of pregnancy. Whereas shoulder stanchions, by contrast, are not as good on feed usage because there's no way to control which sows get that feed. I think it's important. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Quick question on that chart then. So I'm a producer, and why wouldn't I go 100% free access stalls then?
Yeah, great question. So I may go back just for example. At the bottom right, you can see an example of free access stalls where there's one stall for each sow. And that's definitely something that producers are considering here with Prop 12 is, can I adapt 100% free access stalls because I can manage it more similarly to what I have today with gestation stalls? In principle, I think that makes a lot of sense. When the rubber meets the road, though, there's a lot of challenges. Obviously, we still need 24 square feet. So the footprint for a free access stall layout is going to be a lot bigger than a gestation stall barn. But some other challenges exist with free access stalls in that, A, they're quite expensive, They have a lot of metal, and they do have a more moving parts for sows to get in and get out, and that ultimately leads to some maintenance issues down the road. But on top of that, free access stalls versus some other pen scenarios require a few more alleyways because we need to give those sows access to a bore or to being able to have individual treatment. And so typically the free access stall layouts are going to cost 25% or more than some of the other group housing options because of the extra cost of metal and extra footprint that they require. Another challenge that goes along with that I'll talk a little bit more later, and this isn't relegated to free access stalls alone, is when I put a group of sows in a pen, let's say my example pen is 50 sows. If I have 50 free access stalls, I've got one slot per sow. But if I have to mix those sows in pens right at breeding or right after breeding, we all in production know that we're not going to get 100% of those sows pregnant every time. We have some girls that end up open that need to be rebred and possibly relocated or possibly culled. And if we take those girls out of that pen, one of the challenges is that we can't introduce sows back into that pen because they'll end up fighting with their contemporaries. And so the challenge of space utilization is really a trick, no matter what type of group housing you have, but especially with free access stalls if you do them 100%. I hope that answers the question, Brian. Did we have any other questions in the chat that we should handle before I go on?
There was one. Is anything in Prop 12 relating to bores?
Yeah, great question. And as I've been working with a lot of large production systems on these designs, we're obviously trying to figure out how these gray areas are going to be interpreted or enforced down the road. But with regard to bores, it's pretty clear in the text that this legal text applies only to female pigs of breeding age. So technically you could have a certain number of breeding stalls or gestation stalls for your bore housing when you're not using them for housing. But in most cases, people are not doing that too much because they're going to have pens that are versatile enough to be used for bores or sows in different situations. So that's definitely a good question. Another thing that maybe didn't get talked too much earlier, but Brian highlighted the exemption for individual sow treatment. And I think that's an important one too, is we always have sows that are going to need treatment, the percentage of which is going to vary from farm to farm and based on layouts. But we need to be able to individually treat animals, and there is an exemption for those that are being treated. So a lot of producers are keeping a small portion of individual stalls for those type of sows because it is an exemption, and it may be the easiest way to get those girls the help they need. If I move on from this slide, though, I want everybody in the audience to be able to understand the importance of time of mixing on groups. And one of the big reasons today why producers wait until post-preg check to move sows to pens is because there's some very important points with regard to reproduction or reproductive physiology that are going on around that time of mixing if we have to mix them with Prop 12 requirements in mind. So mixing induces stress and can induce some aggression as girls in that pen fight or argue with each other to establish a dominance hierarchy. When that mixing occurs prior to day 21, this can reduce embryo survival and reduce total litter size. But also, if you look at the physiological reference points around day 11 to 12, and some people say that might start earlier, that's typically when a sow recognizes she's pregnant after she's been inseminated. And day 14 to 18 are typically highlighted as the times when the embryos that were fertilized are moving and attaching to the placenta. And that term is typically called implantation. So historically, most producers who are today implementing group housing are trying very hard to avoid stress and aggression around that time because that can have a destabilizing effect and have a negative impact on conception rate and farrowing rate, as well as subsequent litter size. So because of those physiological reference points, the recommended times based on the science that's available is either group those sows within 7 days after breeding or wait until post-implantation or post-preg check. And as I alluded, the vast majority of systems today wait until post-implantation, but there are some farms that do move right after breeding today. And there's some examples of some production systems that do a very good job of that. And I'm guessing that a lot of us producers and experts in the field are going to be making a lot of phone calls to the guys that have been doing that successfully for a few years to see what they can do best to make this work. But current research comparing the mix time of less than 7 days or after preg check has been relatively inconclusive because those are pretty challenging studies to implement. But most science and the dogma of the industry agrees that whatever you can do, avoid mixing sows around 7 to 21 days after breeding. And so most of the people that are implementing Prop 12 are trying hard to get them mixed immediately after breeding before that maternal recognition of pregnancy. I hope that makes sense to you guys in the audience.
Yes, there is one question kind of related to this. Will this completely eliminate breeding stalls immediately after farrowing? With PCAI, pen breeding will be more difficult.
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit more and how a lot of people are adapting that, but I'm getting there soon. It's a good question and we'll cover that. So you're kind of getting to it on this slide here is that producers that are trying to implement Prop 12 at the slat level, you know, more than just a big picture, let's talk about how we're getting things done. There's more than one approach, but certainly still a lot of questions from producers. And so we're working in our company to try to help producers find ways to best utilize the space they have, but also have something that can be successful at the slat level for production teams. Because I can tell you that the average person in a sow farm is not super excited about breeding in pens, moving sows multiple times, and the challenges that go with that. And especially farms that have always been 100% G stalls, it's pretty tough to go from 100% stalls to 100% pens in one big switch. So some of the questions that have been asked to us and been approached differently is how to breed. So back to the question Carissa brought. You know, initially some people think, well, we can just breed in pens, right? Well, that sounds easier than it is. And yes, it can be done. And historically, we did that in farms prior to the advent of indoor facilities and G stalls. A lot of people did breed in pens. But I think most people would agree that doing that requires a keen eye for detail and good stockmanship skills, as well as just more labor or man hours per animal. And that would require some extra cost in terms of having additional laborers on each farm. Free access stalls, which were covered earlier, do offer some advantages here. And they've been one of the more popular options for at least the breeding portion of a Prop 12 implementation. And that's because the free access stall gives her the option to be in the stall or out of the stall. And if you remember the exemptions Brian brought up earlier, we can restrict that sow in a stall for up to 6 hours in a 24-hour period. This is usually ample time to feed the sows, get them in these free access stalls and lock them shut. And they typically have the ability to be locked shut in groups. And by locking those shut, then we can run a bore in front of the stalls, detect who's an estrus, AI those sows. As you can see, I don't have a good zoom picture, but there's actually a bracket in the back of the free access door that allows you to reach in and AI the sow. So free access stalls have been a very popular option. In spite of their extra cost and footprint, they are probably the easiest way to breed sows in the pen if we have to source some new equipment. Furthermore, a third option that a lot of systems are looking closely at, and I don't have a great picture of this, but it's more the concept that some people are looking at, is a lot of producers are saying, could I get rid of one stall or one row of stalls out of every 2 rows and engineer some type of a closing mechanism that allows me to generally leave those stalls open with a pen behind them, but the ability to close them in short term around the time of breeding, and doing this on a subsample of your pens that you target to breeding. So these are the 3 discussions that we typically hear, and most producers are landing on either adding free access stalls in their engineered design or somehow modifying existing stalls in their facility. And that's especially popular on newer farms where they've recently invested in new metal. It's pretty heartbreaking to have to go and take and waste that metal crate or stall if we could modify it somehow cheaper than tearing them out. Post-breeding is definitely a bigger question too. And a lot of questions hover around that breeding period. But after breeding, we've got a lot of questions about how are we feeding those sows? And I talked a little bit earlier about the different feeding system options that exist, and whether or not I can feed sows individually probably becomes even more important in this example, because I now have these sows in pens right after breeding, and I need the ability to feed them according to their body condition. Some sows come out of lactation thin, some come out of lactation in good condition based on feed intake and lactation. I really need to use that early gestation period to get that sow right back in the right body condition. And typically producers who are using pen housing today will use that 7 to 8 weeks in stalls to get each sow back in the right body condition where they know they have her captive and can give her the right amount of feed. Taking that option away and putting her in pens, now all of a sudden the method of feeding that we choose probably becomes a bit more important, because with electronic sow feeding or free access ESFs, for example, we can specifically program on a per sow basis what her feed allowance is, how much feed she gets, and how much that changes per day of gestation. Another important question for post-breeding that I kind of talked about earlier is, what do we do with those sows that fail to conceive? Once we group a group of sows in a pen, we really don't want to have to mix new animals in that pen, or it's a recipe for disaster on sow lameness, sow death loss, and loss of pregnancy. So typically producers are putting these sows in a pen and leaving them there and not adding additional sows to that pen. Well, since we have to move these sows to pens right after breeding, we have to put everyone that was bred in a pen. We all know in pork production, we don't get 100% conception rate. So let's just say optimistically, we get 90% of those sows to confirm pregnant 5 weeks later by ultrasound. We still got to figure out what we're going to do with those 10%. Most producers want to take those 10% out and either cull them or put them back in the breeding stall area, where the free access stall area, where they can be rebred with the next breed group. However, we need to remember that we designed this pen for 24 square feet times the original number of sows. So if I use my 50 head pen example, I now only have 45 sows in that pen. And if they started out at 24 square feet per sow, by only having 45 in there, I now have around 26, 27 square feet per sow. And that just further exacerbates the problem of too much square footage and the extra cost associated with that. So I'll show you in a little bit one strategy that some of our customers are using, but some producers, given the circumstances, just choose to, hey, I don't have to move those sows again. I'll deal with the extra square footage, even though it's gobs and gobs of space. But maximizing space utilization is really critical. And I talked about this earlier, that you always have some lameness and some fallout in pens. And this happens today before Prop 12. And with Prop 12, I don't expect that to get any less. Some of our customers, and we have some pictures and images that I pulled up now, have opted to use optional hospital pens as a way to isolate sows that need individual care and attention. The benefit of this is you can move girls that need isolated into a space in the pen that was already allocated to those sows. So in my example of 50 sows, I have a 6x8 pen down in the right-hand corner that I have a circle around with a gate that can be swung shut, drop, and a waterer in that pen, different design. But I have the ability to individually, sorry, my slides keep advancing, to individually house those girls and give them the attention or treatment or extra feed they need, but I don't have to take them out of the pen and find another space for them. On one pen with 2 sows, that's not a big deal. But when you take that times however many sows you have on the farm, that 2 to 3, 5% of sows that fall out end up representing a large number of sows and a large number of spaces that when we're already talking about losing spaces on these farms, that becomes a big drag on production. So these optional hospital pens of different variations have become a popular option for producers to keep sows in the space they were already allocated as a way to make sure we optimize the space we have. I hope that concept makes sense for people, but I think that's important to do regardless of the feed system chosen for group housing. So I want to move on from there and talk about one example that kind of helps you illustrate what some producers are doing to optimize a retrofit facility to maximize the number of spaces, get sows bred in something that's similar to a breeding stall, but also not have too much cost of extra metal and moving parts. So just to highlight that, I've shown some pictures of a facility at the top, and on the left-hand side would be the first stage that those sows move into. And so I call this the 3-move system because the sows are going to move 3 times through gestation. And just to be clear, a lot of times in existing gestation barns, sows may move 2 to 3 times in those situations as well. But in this example, I have kind of a blown up version of free access stalls. You can see a pen of free access stalls with stalls on either side and a pen behind. So they have 24 square feet, but a producer has the ability to lock them in, detect them in estrus, and breed those sows. And typically producers are keeping about 2 weeks worth of space in free access stalls as a way to house the week of sows that are getting bred right now, as well as some extra space for girls that failed to conceive, that are opportunity females, as well as some incoming gilts to get used to being housed in a crate so that they can get crate broke before they're bred, which helps optimize conception rates. The second phase in that movement is a group of pens that are zoomed in the bottom right, which we call these the early gestation pens. And in these pens, in my example, there's 63 sows per pen. So these would be all the sows that were bred. And one of the things that's worth talking about is how you group those animals in free access stalls before you move them to wherever they're going next. It makes sense to try to group them in free access stalls at pen sizes or divisibles of pen sizes that match up relatively well with where they go afterwards. But in this example, 63 sows using that optional hospital pen as a place to isolate animals, but it can also work as a good place to place a bore when you're doing your heat check on those girls you need to do bore exposure on and see if they took on their pregnancy. We can put that bore in that optional hospital pen and see if we have any girls in heat around 21 days after breeding. So the sows get exposed to pens in that environment there. We're going to pull the animals that fail to conceive out, roughly 10% plus or minus, maybe more. But after we have a stable group of pregnant animals, we make a final move to pens that are sized strategically for the remainder of pregnancy, which is usually going to be 10 to 11 weeks long. So in that example, it's the largest section of the barn, but in those pens, we only need 56 spaces because that's about 10% less than how many were bred. And if you happen to see in this example, we do have gestall feed stations. We have 4 feed stations in early gestation because that's where animals are seeing the gestall system for the first time, and that's where any training might be occurring. But in late gestation, a producer can conserve cost by having 19 animals per station because those animals already know the system after 5 weeks of being in there in early gestation. So it allows producers to have a more cost-efficient space, but also a more cost-efficient technology application to help offset some of the challenges with Prop 12. The other point that I think is worth bringing up is by having a set of early gestation pens rather than pens where every sow can go anywhere, is it allows producers to focus their employees on this group of pens that are highlighted now, because this group of pens are going to be the ones that require the most attention. This is where your animals are going to fight, and maybe you have some initial lameness. This is where you're going to have any animals that need trained or need to adjust onto the feed system. And this is also the area of pens where you need to make darn sure that heat checking and bore exposure is being done well, and animals that are open are identified quickly. One of the biggest problems I've seen on pre-implantation mixing farms, which is what Prop 12 is that producers sometimes struggle with employee turnover or employee quality to do a good job of identifying girls in heat and girls that need to be rebred or culled. And if we leave those girls in that pen for the whole gestation period, they can sometimes create more open sows, but they also really add to non-productive days and add cost to your production system. So moving on from that example, I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of Prop 12. And although I labeled it pros and cons, I'm going to start with cons because I'll be honest, I think there are a lot of cons with this and a lot of challenges that we have to face. There are a few pros that we'll talk about as well, but some of the big picture cons, and this is not an exhaustive list, is that by forcing producers who want to sell pork to California, this disrupts and segregates our pork supply between California pork and other pork. And if you talk to any packers and procurement people, segregating meat products is a challenge and very costly. And that adds to the cost of the entire supply chain, and that moves back up to us on the cost of production and ends up on the customer's plate, adding to the cost at their end at their purchase. Because 12% of the population lives in California, and I failed to mention earlier that in California, there's large percentage of the population are Hispanic or Asian, and those demographics are known to be large pork consumers, and they actually have a higher per capita intake of pork. So most analysts are projecting around 15% of U.S. farms need to convert to Prop 12 compliance in order to produce the necessary pork for California. We already talked about the cost of $1,600 to $2,500 per sow, and the fact that only about 4% of sow farms today are compliant for this. With that expensive transition, that increases the total footprint of the sow farm, forces producers to build more and spend money building, and all of this worsens carbon footprint, which we as an industry have been working very hard to reduce our carbon footprint, and now we've worsened that, and this adds challenges to permitting as well. I've already talked as well about mixing sows immediately after breeding. It can be done, and there are producers who are doing this with very high levels of productivity. But I think most people would agree that it takes very good labor and probably more labor in order to do pre-implantation mixing and achieve high levels of productivity and reproductive success. We already have a dearth of good labor in many of our farms today, and if we combine the challenge of labor quality and quantity with Prop 12 implementation, most producers and production systems that I work with are not seeing Prop 12 as something that's going to be good for sow farm productivity. Right now, the question is how bad is it going to be? But a lot of the examples and layouts that we're doing are using somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5% reduction in farrowing rate when they convert to Prop 12. And that adds to the cost that's already pretty onerous, but not included in that transition cost we already talked earlier. So big picture, forcing producers to go to Prop 12 is going to further increase the cost of production. And our industry has consolidated very heavily in the past couple decades. But when we put onerous standards on us like this likely leads to further consolidation in our industry. And I think most of us would agree that that isn't necessarily a good thing for the industry long term. And finally, and as a PhD myself, one of the things that's the most frustrating to me about Prop 12 is that most of the standards that have been put in place are not supported by science. And I really wish we had science-backed solutions to improve animal welfare, because I'm a supporter of improving animal welfare and I like to help producers do that. But when standards like this are put in place, all they do is make things harder and may not even improve animal welfare long term. But the glass half full attitude in me, I will say there are some pros. You know, big picture, 24 square feet does give sows more space to turn around. And when managed well, as I talked about, these farms can be productive. And if they're managed well, this may improve the welfare of most of the sows on the farm. And so I think those are good things and silver linings that we can certainly appreciate. One thing that I think could be, again, a silver lining for the industry is implementing pre-implantation mixing is going to force the industry to improve our stockmanship on farm. And I think this is something that the industry as a whole could benefit from, having more laborers that are good stockmen. And that the pork industry can benefit from that if we do that the right way. For some early adopters who capitalize on opportunities to produce for Prop 12 in California, they could receive some premiums that help them offset their cost, or maybe even increase their incentive by giving them a premium above their cost of transition. And I think, again, one of the good things about this is, thankfully, this does not apply to farrowing. And at least in farrowing, we have the ability to use farrowing crates or something similar to help prevent pre-weaning mortality or minimize pre-weaning mortality and handle our sows safely. I'm at least glad that this law is not forcing producers to change there. But we can certainly ask the question of when is that coming next? Enforcement is, I think, something that may not be being fully appreciated by most people today. I had the privilege of working with a third-party animal welfare auditing agency during my PhD and got to live in those shoes. And I think at some point after we design these farms and we make these farms compliant, somebody is going to need to come into the farm or enforce these regulations on farm. I think it's a big question right now is who's going to do that and who's going to pay for it. The state of California is who's enforcing these laws or implementing these laws, but most people agree that the state of California itself doesn't have the manpower or resources to enforce this themselves. So the other two options are whether companies will be allowed to internally audit their own farms. I think most people see conflict of interest and opportunity for abuse on that. And so probably third-party auditing agencies, similar to the company I worked for in the past, being the de facto choice for who's going to be coming into these farms and assessing whether they comply for these standards. I think the question is when is that going to happen? This is supposed to take effect at the beginning of 2022, but a lot of these production systems that are trying to convert are likely going to be still in the middle of conversion, and the pork industry in general is going to be trying to figure out how to segregate the pork supply and deliver it to California, let alone enforce production systems for complying. But how often do these auditors need to come to the farm? In my past life, they would come every 15 months to see the farm at different intervals. But, is that often enough to enforce compliance? Who knows? How are these farms going to be penalized for non-compliance? That's going to be a big question. There's going to be some producers who I expect to asking for permission may be harder than just asking for forgiveness. And so it'll be interesting to see how some of those different production systems handle those situations when they arise and at the time that they arise. One of the things that lands on me and Brian's plate a lot is I'm working to design these farms for these producers to get the most out of the space they have and maximize their spaces, but still have a farm that can be compliant for Prop 12. There are some gray areas that are challenging to figure out how an auditor is going to interpret those. How many animals were placed in that pen versus how many animals remain in that pen long term? Do we have pens that are all the exact same size? Do we always have the same number of animals that stay pregnant every week? Absolutely not. How much acceptable variation or tolerance is there going to be for the normal biological variance that exists in any livestock enterprise? I think how those get audited and enforced is going to make a big difference on how some of these farms have to adjust to those compliance measures. But I think those are important questions that we all have to ask ourselves, trying to find something that both complies to the letter of the law, but also works on farm and allows us to have good animal welfare.
Hey, Hyatt.
So with that, yeah, Brian.
Hey, I wanted to jump in there. So a question I've got is, you said that 3 to 5% hit on pre-implantation, right? And you outlined several ways we do it with keeping the groups intact, trying to minimize fighting. Is there other takeaways that we should all hear that we've been doing or seeing to minimize that?
Yeah, to minimize that fallout rate, you're saying?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question and a good point to maybe elaborate a little bit on is we know that number is not zero, right? But even today in group housing environments, there's lameness, there's girls that abort or lose pregnancy and have to be handled accordingly. I think that example of optional hospital pens is a very good point, but also sizing those pens strategically is a good thing. There can be pens that are too big that make it very hard to find a sow that needs identified. And there can be pens that are too small that make it costly because of extra metal or extra water, feeding stations, etc., or can make it easy for sows to have too much aggression with each other. And so, how to minimize that aggression, feeding systems like the one we work with can help with that. Some producers that use our free access ESF precision feeder, they'll give sows extra feed at the time of mixing as a way to keep those sows full and satiated during that initial mixing aggression as a way to minimize how many get lame or hurt during that time. But it also can be optimized by feeding precisely. If we're not having a lot of competitive aggression around the time of feeding, we can make sure that those sows stay in good body condition, because typically some of the sows that fall out of those pens are girls that get too thin or get too fat. And if we choose a good feeding system that minimizes the number of sows that fall into that category, that can help us maintain the number of sows we initially put in those pens and take them to farrowing as an intact group. But, just for example, farms that we have today, most farms range from 2 to 5% fallout rate in pens. And that's a big difference. So it shows that even in farms that are using the same housing system and the same general design, execution and implementation can be different between farm. And so I really try to learn from those farms that are doing 2% fallout, because that seems to be about as good as you can do, and trying to emulate that and design facilities that can be successful for that is one of our key goals. I don't know if there's any other points that I missed there, Brian, that you might want to touch on. Did you have anything else in mind that you were thinking?
I think I saw some questions come in. Probably Carissa will ask them too.
Sure. I'll kind of wrap up here with some key takeaways quick, Carissa, and then we can go to those questions. So some of the key takeaways that hopefully we've covered in this big picture talk. First of all, I'll say that we are just one segment of this whole Prop 12 equation. And so we don't try to be experts in things we're not, but designing facilities and implementing Prop 12 is what our specialty is, and we're working hard to help producers do that successfully. Many people are still kind of banking on this getting overturned by the Supreme Court or legal challenges. And what Brian and I are seeing is that the vast majority of large production systems have already started in this process. We've got a lot of farms that have already committed to make these changes, and a lot more that are in halfway through that process. So I fully expect that regardless of the legal challenges, there's a lot of money that's already been invested in making this change. And free market capitalists that we Americans are, I think the production systems that have already made those changes are going to stick with it and try to use that as a point of differentiation against those that haven't. So I think whether we like it or not, the train has left the station. It's just a question of how big and how many farms we have to get this way. I think many people will agree that 2021 and 2022 are going to be learning years for our industry. And I hope we use this time to learn and then adapt and evolve to a better system that can, A, get back to productivity that we expect and still give sows the animal welfare requirements that rules like Prop 12 are requiring. A big question is this going to stop in California? I'll just use the example I was given from somebody is a meat packer company has a warehouse in Las Vegas, but a lot of the meat from that warehouse ends up in California. When they're sending meat to that warehouse, is it easier for them to send both types of meat, Prop 12 compliant and non-Prop 12 compliant? Or is it easier for them to just send only Prop 12 compliant meat to that warehouse? And for customers in Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, is it just easier for them to get Prop 12 compliant meat as well? And I think many would argue that this may slowly work its way back towards the rest of the U.S. And Brian's already outlined that Massachusetts also has a similar law. How long until other ballot initiatives or legal challenges are put in place in other states? I think a lot of producers are asking that question to adopt strategically. Moreover, these are just some specific animal welfare requirements. What's coming next? Farrowing crates and physical castration are two things that I've seen Europe regulate and eliminate in some cases, as well as Australia and some other countries that are pretty progressive on animal welfare requirements. I think we'd be foolish to think that those aren't coming next to us. And for some of these producers that are spending the time and renovating, it makes sense for them to try horizon so that whatever they do now may also be compliant in 5 years when that next regulation takes place. So things like farrowing crate design, turnaround farrowing crates, for example, are what some producers are using during these renovations as a way to comply for that coming regulation that they anticipate to happen at some point. That being said, I want to kind of end my part on a positive note, is that remember, it was only about 40 years ago, almost all sows were housed outdoors and managed that way. As an industry, we've constantly adapted and evolved successfully to raise sows better and provide a wholesome pork product to consumers. In spite of the onerous challenges of Prop 12, we can and will adapt this successfully. It's just going to be a learning process and a changing world for us for the next couple of years. So with that, I will hand off to Carissa if she has any good questions, and hopefully we have some further discussion, because we definitely just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, there are some questions coming into the chat box. So if you have any more, keep adding those. But for a large dynamic systems versus pens, how would we synchronize the gilts and return the open sows?
Yeah, great question. I've been involved in some of the production team discussions on this. If you recall, when I talked about the number of free access stalls that most of these farms are using as a minimum, they're keeping around 2 weeks of space in free access stalls, plus or minus, to not only breed the girls that are currently weaned and coming into heat, but to have enough turns and opportunity females to go back into a crate. So on a weekly farm flow, when those girls come into heat, they could be moved right back to the stall group with the current breed week and bred off of that estrus and fall right into a breeding group. But for example, there are a lot of production systems that have recently or in the past years converted to batch farrowing. There's some good advantages with batch farrowing, and we've been involved in a lot of these batch farrowing transitions. But to your question, batch farrowing creates some real challenges with regard to Prop 12, because we need to have at least one batch, maybe 2 batches of free access stalls in order to house those girls till they can be confirmed pregnant and have enough to breed on. But also for those girls that do return to estrus, we have to use a synchronization agent like Matrix to get those girls back into a breed group. So I see a lot of people planning on using free access stalls as the way to implement giving those girls a synchronization agent. But I do know that some electronic sow feeding systems do have the ability to deliver small doses of this. And so if that can be done consistently, that remains an option as well.
Okay, next one is, if a farm has to drop sows by 20 to 25%, can part of the reduction be partly recovered by running a longer lactation length or weaning out older pigs may cheapen the nursery feeds?
Great question. This was immediately where my head went on some scenarios too. I will first say it depends. You know, there are farms today that already have pretty short weaning age. I'm gonna refrain from using specific names, but I was working with a producer in Kansas that currently weans at 18 to 19 days. They acknowledge that they should increase their wean age, but today they have X number of pigs they produce per week, and they like that, and they get along okay with 18 to 19 day wean pigs. But with a Prop 12 conversion, for them, that was kind of the glass half full that they saw, is that by losing the number of gestation spaces they had, they could at least lengthen their wean age to maybe a 23 or 24 day wean age and have a pig that's more ready for weaning, that could adapt to a wean to finish scenario more easily, or probably have a cheaper nursery diet formulation and offset a little bit of the cost that way, as well as probably some survivability to finishing advantages. That being said, I've got some other farms that are already at 24 day wean age. So for them, is there really a major advantage to go to a 27 or 28 day wean age? Not so much, based on the science that's available today. So it depends on where you're at today, and depends on what your first priority is. If your first priority is wean the same number of pigs because you've got downstream flow that needs to be filled by that size group, then you're probably going to be leaning towards adding on space, or maybe cannibalizing a farrowing space or a GDU to get your gestation spaces back up to where you were at. So it depends, but that is definitely a scenario that some producers are choosing, is to increase wean age. And I think that can be a good thing for the industry in those situations that they choose to do so.
I think we need to address the body condition scoring there as well, for amount of back fat as she's leaving farrowing, making sure she's well fed before she goes and she leaves farrowing.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we see a lot of variation in our business with lactation feeding. there remains a lot of variation in sow body condition leaving farrowing. And I already talked a little bit about how Prop 12 challenges some of those things with not being able to house them in individual stalls and feed them strategically post-breeding. But getting those sows to maintain body condition and lactation for Prop 12 farms is going to be even more important. And Carissa, to your question, or the question that was posed to you, if we extend wean age, sometimes this can increase the variation in body condition because some sows need to be weaned early because they're utilizing a lot of their body condition and not eating enough feed, while other sows can maintain a long lactation with no issues. And so bringing sows into farrowing at the right body condition is the first priority, and then getting those sows to eat and maintain body condition in farrowing is the second priority. But it is an important part of this whole equation because that's really the linchpin where everything hinges on to get the other parts right.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, have many producers asked about making a portion of their farm compliant to Prop 12 and not the whole farm to conserve some costs? And would that even be possible?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Somebody's probably been asked that question too. I have worked with some producers who are pursuing that and producing a percentage of their sows for Prop 12. I think there's some big questions on how that's going to be interpreted by third-party auditors, because it could be a sneaky way to get some sows that comply but have a place to go for those that don't. But in my past experience with third-party auditing, that would be a pretty big red flag for non-compliance and be written up as somebody that's kind of trying to have their cake and eat it too. That being said, I do think that there'll be some people that may try that, and who knows, it might be something that ends up being acceptable by the state of California. I think time will tell on that, but I would say that most farms that we're working with are not approaching it that way, but it has come up, probably at least a dozen times in conversations in the past 6 to 9 months. And I think physically speaking, we can set up the farm to do that. It's kind of like antibiotic-free production. If we don't use antibiotics until they get sick, then only the animals that need to be treated with antibiotics don't qualify, and they can go to a separate downstream marketing source. We could try to house animals at Prop 12 requirements, and then if they need to fall out for some reason, they could go back to a conventional system. But it does increase some challenges with logistics and record keeping. And again, I think from a third-party auditing standpoint, that's not really the intent of the California law, but it's one of those areas where I would say is probably pretty gray, and it's going to be interesting how that gets enforced in 2022 and 2023 particularly.
Okay, next question is, will this keep going into the Whole Foods 32 square feet per sow that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk?
Yeah, great question. I've had the privilege to work with producers who have adopted GAP standards, and that includes that 32 square foot per sow. Whole Foods and GAP were obviously trying to set the bar pretty high for their standards and differentiate themselves from the conventional sources of pork on the market. And I think they still want to be an outlier in that respect. I think in most commercial grocery stores and consumers, that's still seen as pretty out there, some of the requirements that are involved with GAP, and we didn't even touch on a lot of those. So I don't anticipate GAP itself to become 100% of U.S. sow production, but I think it kind of serves as a bellwether for where we might go. And some of these, typically what I see is the animal welfare standards that have taken effect or been passed in Europe and the United Kingdom and Australia, typically they come to us 5 to 10 years later. And I would expect those to be the best examples of what we're likely to face next. And I'm sure they'll continue to trickle down that path, but I don't anticipate the GAP standards as they're written to be anything that the majority of the industry is going to have to adopt anytime soon.
Okay, this question is related to like the portion production question that we just had. Could larger multi-site systems designate individual sites to one market or the other? Or would that be a gray area?
Again,
too?
I still think it's a gray area, but that would be, I work with many farms that, kind of have two sites in one. And I think that if they already operate as kind of sister farms, but they are all kind of connected by alleyways and such, I think that's a gray area that would be pretty easy for a producer to defend and say that, we are really operating this group of sows by Prop 12 requirements and this group of sows another way. So I think those type of systems are going to be easier than taking a percentage of sows within a single roof and trying to segregate them. But I would say that that's going to come down to the interpretation and probably how some of the letter of the law gets interpreted. But to my knowledge, and I've read the legal text pretty closely, trying to help producers with designs, to my knowledge, there is nothing that forbids that today. It's one of those gray areas that's going to be interesting to see how it gets enforced.
I think we need to say different labor requirements on that too, Hyatt, as far as heat checking, one versus the other. There are different requirements. If the same labor at the farm, making sure that they're running a Prop 12 operation separately from their pen farm.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, that's all the questions I see in the chat box. So does anyone else have any other questions? Or still, oh, there's one more. Are you hearing any incentives from packers to help make the transition? If so, how much are they talking? $2 per hundredweight, for example?
Yeah, I've heard some of this, and usually I don't get too involved in these discussions, but at the same token, we obviously are privy to some of this. There are a few packers that are starting to offer some incentives for independent producers, and I like to hear that versus just integrated production making the move to California requirements, because hopefully that independence a chance to stay in the industry long term. I've heard a number around $8 per pig of premium per weaned pig, for example, to produce for a said amount of said packer. I haven't been privy to very much as far as if you have a finished hog going to a packer and complying, but at the weaned pig price of $8 per pig additional is what I'm seeing. Now, when you back calculate that to how much it costs per weaned pig, the range that I've seen is about $8 to $12 per weaned pig to become compliant. So $8 a weaned pig sounds good, but it may not be all that good. But guaranteeing it for 5 years is a way that I've heard some packers incentivizing that and getting some producers interested in making the jump. And I do think that this is probably going to be best for some early adopters. And then there's probably going to be some penalties or discounts that get put on people later for not being compliant for this and other terms. And that's one thing that scares me about hurting independent producers who may not be financially or logistically able to make that conversion.
Were you talking about $8, 8% per weaned pig?
$8 per weaned pig was a number that I've heard multiple times from at least one significant packer. Now, I know of some other packers that are not offering anything. They're saying, yeah, we want Prop 12 hogs, but when the producer asks them how much they'll give, they won't give anything yet. So certainly it's going to be interesting to see how many people go Prop 12 without those type of agreements versus those that wait until they have something concrete to move that direction.
Okay, and Dr. Rickert said that would basically be a 10-year payback.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hearing as well. And so okay. It isn't all that good in the big picture when you really look at it. But, one thing that I'm seeing, and this is maybe a helpful example, is, for example, a lot of these farms that are group housed today, and most of the numbers I hear in the industry are 40 to 50% of the U.S. sow industry today is group housed post-preg check. I will say that for a producer that already has group housing for half of the sows, it's going to be cheaper for them to rip out the remaining stalls they have, maybe change the stocking density they have in those pens, but their cost to retrofit is going to be a little bit different than somebody that's 100% stalls. Same goes for somebody that is currently mixing right after breeding versus currently mixing after preg check. So a lot of production systems that maybe have some of those farms that are partway there those become a logical choice to go to Prop 12 because they're going to be the cheapest investment. But also keep in mind things like there's a lot of farms that have aging metal and material that needs renovation on a regular, a certain percentage of farms need retrofitted each year anyways. So if they have stalls that are already worn out, rusted out, and need replacement, maybe biting the bullet and going to Prop 12 instead of putting stalls back in is going to be the logical choice for those farms because it's going to be what they see as a future direction, and whereas 100% stalls is probably not a very safe choice long term right now.
Okay. So you normally would gestate a startup farm from a farrowing crate. How would that be handled?
I think that's a very prescient question. Startups is challenging, and we have the privilege or curse to work with producers who are faced with this scenario, and that's been one of the big things that Brian and I and my team have been focusing on is implementation of group housing is critical. And when you have a new farm startup and a new team, new faces, people that may not know pigs really well, being very strategic about how you breed and how you move those girls into pens becomes even more important when you don't have hardly any stalls. So I find that getting involved in those conversations early, making sure producers have a plan, those things are pretty critical. But what I see some producers doing on the startups we have been involved in for Prop 12 is they'll secure some finishing feeders from some other sites or purchase some extra ones and temporarily place those in some of these gestation pens that may have ESFs, but have gilts that are too young to use the ESF successfully, for example. Place some finishing feeders in there, convert them into a GDU feeding area where workers aren't having to spend a lot of time making sure gilts are eating because their time on a new startup needs to be focused on finding girls in heat, breeding girls, and then getting girls trained and moved into pens strategically, because starting that snake and pen movement correctly is critical to the success of getting that farm off to the right start. And working with a lot of producers in retrofits is also something that we deal with a lot as well. And producers that are trying to retrofit to Prop 12 often don't want to have to depopulate the farm in which to do so. So they're trying to figure out ways where they can make enough room for a construction group to come in and renovate, tear out stalls, put in a certain number and type of pens, and then backfill those pens with gestating sows again. Again, this is a big puzzle that we're trying to move around on Pig Flow, and it's the responsibility of people like us and production teams to dot your I's and cross your T's to make sure that those transitions can be successful. But we already work with that on normal group housing, and most people have learned how to do that relatively successfully. It's just that with Prop 12, we're taking away almost all of the stalls that can be used, and that makes things harder.
When we're making a bubble, we like to be sure we're talking with the whole group, the whole production staff. That way they got buy-in, so nobody's going to short circuit it or push back. Make sure everybody knows what's required during that transition.
We have seen some farms do very well by, if they have an empty finisher somewhere or an empty sow farm, if this is a large system that's converting, they may earmark an empty facility to temporarily house some sows while they take them out of the farm they're renovating. And then after that section of renovation is done, they move them back. So that on larger systems has been a popular choice if they have the space to do it with.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions I see in the chat box. So if anyone joined on late, this was recorded by Dr. Radcliffe. So if you want the recording, contact Dr. Radcliffe or Dr. Schinkel at Purdue. So I just want to say thank you to our speakers. If anyone could give a virtual round of applause. So thank you for spending time out of your day to come talk with us and inform us about this very pressing matter. So thank you.
Well, it's challenging, and we're glad to be a part of it. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share our experience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.